The night was still buzzing in the Bronx, the air thick with bass, cigarette smoke, and ambition. A young man stood near the DJ booth, quiet, watching. He wasn't there to perform, he was there to learn to study how power moved through people, how a song could turn struggle into celebration. They called him Baby Chris back then. He carried records, kept the peace, and made sure the music never stopped. What no one knew was that this kid from the Bronx would soon become one of the most powerful deal-makers hip-hop had ever seen. But behind the platinum records and million-dollar brand deals, there was a darkness he could never quite escape. What happens when the man who builds other people's dreams can't save his own? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab a warm drink, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Chris Lighty was born on the 8th of May, 1968, in the Bronx, New York, a place that was both a battlefield and a birthplace of culture. He was the oldest of 6 children, raised by a single mother who worked herself to exhaustion just to keep food on the table. His parents split when he was only 6, leaving him to grow up fast and become the man of the house. His mother believed in discipline and education, so she sent him to a private school, one of the few black students in the class. Every day was a fight, literally and figuratively. He'd come home with bruises, but also with the quiet pride of knowing he had survived another round. The Bronx was unforgiving, but it taught him something no textbook ever could: how to read people, how to move carefully, how to stay 2 steps ahead. Outside the classroom, another kind of education was happening. The streets pulsed with a new rhythm, the birth of hip-hop. Park jams lit up the summer nights, as DJs wired turntables to lamp posts and spun vinyl until sunrise. Young Chris was there, watching legends in the making: Kool Herc, Afrika Bambaataa, and the early crews that turned the Bronx into the heartbeat of a movement. For a kid who didn't have much, the music was proof that something powerful could grow out of nothing. When his mother remarried, Chris's world changed again. The new husband was abusive, and his mother eventually sent Chris to live with relatives for his own safety. Those years hardened him. He learned not to trust easily, but he also learned independence. By the time he finished high school, he had both street instincts and a sharp, analytical mind. He studied electrical engineering for a short while and landed a job at Metro-North Railroad as an electrician. It was steady work, but Chris wanted more. Nights in the Bronx clubs were calling him back, the same world he had grown up around. But now he saw it differently. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was business waiting to happen. In the mid-'80s, he met DJ Red Alert, one of the pioneers of hip-hop radio. Chris and his crew, known for their charisma and toughness, offered to help Red Alert carry his vinyl crates and act as security at gigs. Red Alert noticed something rare in Chris, a mix of hustle and intelligence. He was street smart but also thoughtful, always observing how the industry worked. The crew earned a name that would soon define an era: the Violators. They weren't just bodyguards, they were the bridge between the rough reality of the streets and the rising world of rap music. Everyone in New York knew them. They had a reputation. If you messed with Red Alert or his artists, the Violators would make sure you regretted it. Chris became known as Baby Chris, partly because of his boyish looks, partly because he was the youngest of the crew. But there was nothing baby about his ambition. He began handling logistics, managing relationships, and helping artists get from show to show. It wasn't long before Red Alert saw in him something bigger: leadership. Through Red Alert, Chris was introduced to the Native Tongues Collective, a family of groundbreaking groups like Jungle Brothers, De La Soul, and A Tribe Called Quest. These weren't street rappers, they were poets, thinkers, and innovators. They needed someone who understood both the art and the chaos surrounding it. That someone was Chris Lighty. Red Alert made him the road manager for the Jungle Brothers, a move that would change his life. Suddenly, Chris was traveling, learning the business side of music: first-hand contracts, promoters, budgets, and tour logistics. He wasn't on stage, but he was always in control behind it. His calm under pressure made him indispensable. By the late 1980s, his name was starting to circulate through the industry. On A Tribe Called Quest's track, What? Q-Tip dropped his name. What is Chris Lighty if he wasn't such a baby? It was an inside joke, but also a sign of respect, a nod to the man who kept the operation running smoothly while others took the spotlight. Then came one night that changed everything. It was Queen Latifah's birthday party in Manhattan, the kind of night that brought all of hip-hop's brightest stars together. Chris arrived late with a friend, tried to skip the line, and got into a fight outside the club. Someone slashed his face with a razor. In seconds, chaos erupted. Chris called in the Violators, and by the time the dust settled, the entire club was wrecked. Queen Latifah's mother was injured in the stampede. That night left a scar literally and figuratively. Liar Cohen, a rising executive at Def Jam, pulled Chris aside afterward and gave him a warning. If you want to make it in this business, you've got to leave the streets behind. For Chris, that was the turning point. The violence, the chaos, the code of the block, it all had to end. He had seen too many people fall to it. He wanted something bigger. He wanted to be the man behind the machine, not just part of the noise. And so, baby Chris, the fighter, the fixer, the kid from the Bronx began to reinvent himself as Chris Lighty, the businessman. Before the world knew his name, he was already learning the art of power, how to protect artists, how to close deals, and how to make sure everyone got paid. But more than anything, he was learning that in hip-hop, survival wasn't just about who could fight, it was about who could evolve. By the late 1980s, Chris Lighty had built a reputation as the quiet enforcer, someone who understood both sides of the hip-hop world, the street hustle and the corporate boardroom. He wasn't just keeping artists safe anymore, he was learning how to keep their careers alive. Through DJ Red Alert, he connected with the native tongues, a movement that would reshape the sound and soul of early hip-hop. The Jungle Brothers, De La Soul, A Tribe Called Quest, and Queen Latifah all spoke a different language of rap, one that celebrated creativity, consciousness, and culture. Chris became their road manager, their fixer, their anchor. He learned how to negotiate club deals, handle travel logistics, and manage tour finances. But more importantly, he learned how to read the room, how to talk to promoters, labels, and executives without losing the authenticity that made hip-hop powerful. He was young, but everyone who met him said the same thing. He had vision. It was Red Alert who first recognized that Chris wasn't just a street guy who knew how to handle himself. He was a businessman waiting to be shaped. Red Alert began introducing him to industry veterans, and one of them was Liar Cohen, a rising figure at Rush Management and Def Jam. At the time, Rush Management represented the biggest names in the game: Run DMC, LL Cool J, Public Enemy, Eric B., and Rakim. It was the beating heart of hip-hop's new empire. Lior had heard about this sharp kid from the Bronx who could organize, lead, and handle problems before they ever reached the artists. When they finally met, Chris was skeptical. He had seen the dark side of the music business, the drugs, the egos, the excess. But Lior saw something in him that few did: discipline, intellect, and integrity. He told Chris that if he could learn the business side, really learn it, he could change the industry. Chris accepted the offer and joined Rush Management. It was like walking into a new universe. Instead of nightclubs and block parties, he was sitting in offices with contracts stacked high and phones ringing off the hook. He paid attention to everything: how Russell Simmons handled meetings, how Liar spoke to lawyers, how deals were structured. He noticed something surprising. Many of the top executives didn't even read their contracts carefully. Chris started reading them, every clause, every number, every loophole. Within months, he knew more about the fine print than most people in the room. He wasn't just a manager anymore. He was becoming a strategist. When Rush Management folded in the early 1990s, Liar and Russell gave him an opportunity most young men would have killed for: pick any artist you want to manage. Chris chose wisely. He took Brand Nubian, LL Cool J, De La Soul, and later, Busta Rhymes. These were artists with potential, energy, and attitude, the perfect reflection of who he was. He founded Violator Management, naming it after his old Bronx crew. But this time, Violator wasn't about street fights or toughness, it was about breaking barriers, rewriting rules, and changing how artists did business. Chris built a team that treated management like an art form. He didn't just focus on shows and records, he looked for brands, long before that word became fashionable in hip-hop. He wanted his clients to make money beyond music endorsements, commercials, and cross-industry collaborations. He believed that hip-hop deserved a seat at the corporate table, and if no one was going to invite them in, he'd kick the door open himself. One of his early wins came when he helped the group Black Sheep land a deal with Mercury Records. Then he brokered connections between De La Soul and A Tribe Called Quest that strengthened the Native Tongues network. Word spread quickly. If you wanted results, you called Chris Lighty. He also formed Violator Flavor Unit Management with Queen Latifah's partner Shakim Compere combining their rosters to create one of the most influential management collectives in the '90s. This alliance opened new doors, more tours, bigger sponsorships, and new respect for artist managers in hip-hop. For Chris, every challenge was a test of patience and intelligence. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but his quiet presence carried weight. Executives trusted him. Artists loved him. He could walk into a corporate boardroom in the morning, then head straight to the Bronx at night, and still be respected on both sides. By the early 1990s, he was managing some of the most talked-about names in rap. He had earned something even more valuable than fame credibility. And yet, deep down, he knew he was only getting started. There was still a line to cross from respected manager to power broker, from representing artists to reshaping how the industry worked. That opportunity came when he began negotiating directly with Def Jam Records. It was here that the next phase of his story would begin, a phase that would test his loyalty, his resilience, and his ability to stay true to himself in a business that rewarded greed over grace. In the early 1990s, Chris Lighty had moved beyond the role of road manager. He was now the man behind some of hip-hop's most promising acts, a deal-maker with both credibility and heart. His work with Rush Management had sharpened his instincts. His years on the road had hardened his resolve. And his Bronx roots reminded him that loyalty was everything. But success in the music business is never simple. The same streets that once made him strong were now watching him closely, waiting for him to slip. By 1994, Chris had already begun rewriting the rules of what an artist manager could be. He heard a song called Indo Smoke by Warren G and Mr. Grimm on the Poetic Justice soundtrack and immediately saw potential. He believed Warren G's smooth, melodic G-funk sound could open new doors for Def Jam, a label that, at the time, was struggling to compete with West Coast rap. Chris brought Warren G to Def Jam and negotiated one of the most successful signings of the decade. The album Regulate, G-Funk Era went triple platinum, earning Def Jam millions and putting Warren G on the map. But that success came with risk. Suge Knight, one of the most feared men in hip-hop, believed Warren G belonged to Death Row Records. When tensions rose, Chris didn't flinch. He personally stood between Suge and Leor Cohen, protecting his boss with nothing but a gun on his hip and his reputation to back it up. That moment became legend in industry circles. Chris Lighty had faced down Suge Knight and lived to tell about it. More importantly, he had proven that he could handle business under pressure. He wasn't just a manager anymore, he was a power broker. Soon after, he played a crucial role in LL Cool J's comeback. The album Mr. Smith was a defining moment. It brought LL back to the top of the charts, going double platinum. Behind the scenes, Chris had brought in producer duo Trackmasters and set up the collaboration with Boyz II Men for the hit single, Hey Lover. That song alone reshaped LL's image from a hardcore MC to a mature artist with crossover appeal. Chris was building a new model for success, one that combined music, marketing, and image management into one seamless operation. He then introduced Foxy Brown to Def Jam, securing her debut album Il Na Na, which went double platinum. He was also the one who brought a young Jay-Z into the room to ghostwrite her verses, an early connection that would later redefine hip-hop's business landscape. By the mid-1990s, Chris Lighty's name was whispered in every studio and corporate hallway. He was known for being calm but unbreakable, strategic but loyal. Artists trusted him with their money and their dreams, something rare in an industry built on broken promises. But not every story in hip-hop stays clean. One day, DMX, who had just joined Def Jam, heard that Lighty had disrespected him in a meeting, calling him a crackhead. The rumor wasn't true. It had come from Chris's brother, Dave Lighty. But DMX didn't care. He punched Chris square in the mouth, knocking out a tooth. The old Chris might have fought back. The new Chris made a deal. Instead of retaliation, he accepted royalty points on DMX's next album, Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood. The record went triple platinum. The punch that should have cost him respect ended up making him richer than ever. That's how Chris Lighty handled conflict with business, not emotion. In 1999, he released Violator, the album, a compilation that showcased artists he managed and represented: Busta Rhymes, Q-Tip, Missy Elliott, Fat Joe, LL Cool J, and more. The lead single Vibrant Thing by Q-Tip hit #1 on the Billboard R&B charts. It wasn't just an album, it was a statement. Violator was no longer just a management company, it was an empire. But behind the growing success, small fractures were forming. Chris began to clash with Liar Cohen over Irv Gotti, the loud and ambitious producer who was now Def Jam's new star A&R. Chris believed Irv was reckless, while Liar saw him as essential to the label's next wave. The tension grew until Chris made a decision that shocked everyone. He walked away from Def Jam. For most people, leaving one of the biggest labels in the world would have been career suicide. For Chris Lighty, it was liberation. He was hired almost immediately by Arista Records as executive vice president, where he continued to expand his influence. There, he signed Mobb Deep and released Violator, the album Volume 8, 2 inches, 2001. The project further cemented his ability to move between worlds, from executive boardrooms to studio sessions, without ever losing his connection to the streets. That same year, fate introduced him to a young artist who would change everything, 50 Cent. At the time, 50 was a talented rapper with a dangerous reputation. Most labels refused to touch him. Chris saw potential where others saw risk. He believed in 50's storytelling, his hunger, his raw truth. He negotiated the deal with Shady, divided by Aftermath, and turned what was once a street mixtape into a global phenomenon. When Get Rich or Die Tryin' dropped in 2003, it sold over 13 million copies worldwide. Chris didn't just manage an artist, he built a brand, one that would soon extend into sneakers, clothing, video games, and even beverages. He had crossed the line he'd always dreamed of, from being the man behind the music to being the architect of an empire. And yet, even as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the shadows around him. Because in Hollywood and in hip-hop, every rise carries the seed of its own fall. By the early 2000s, Chris Lighty had become one of the most powerful men in hip-hop, a quiet force behind the fame. The same kid who once carried crates for DJs was now closing million-dollar deals in boardrooms across New York and Los Angeles. To his artists, he wasn't just a manager, he was a protector, a strategist, and a teacher. Violator management had grown into an empire. His roster read like a who's who of hip-hop royalty: LL Cool J, Missy Elliott, Busta Rhymes, Fat Joe, Foxy Brown, and soon, 50 Cent. Chris treated every artist like a brand before branding was a buzzword. He taught them how to think bigger, how to own their image, how to turn talent into longevity. When 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Tryin' dropped in 2003, everything changed. It wasn't just a hit album, it was a cultural takeover. Chris had negotiated the record deal with Shady, divided by Aftermath, and quietly built an ecosystem around it. G-Unit Clothing with Marc Ecko, a sneaker line with Reebok, and a video game called Bulletproof. Each project connected music, fashion, and lifestyle in a way the industry had never seen. But the crowning jewel came with the Vitaminwater deal. Instead of taking a one-time check, Chris secured 50 Cent an equity stake in the company, a visionary move that later became one of the most talked-about business decisions in hip-hop history. When Coca-Cola bought Glasso, both men walked away with life-changing money. To Chris, that deal wasn't about greed, it was about proving that hip-hop could compete with corporate America on its own terms. He also kept pushing his older clients toward reinvention. LL Cool J's Mr. Smith album had already restored his career. But the real masterstroke came with the Gap commercial, the one where LL wore a FUBU hat on national television, sneaking a black-owned brand into mainstream culture. Chris orchestrated it all quietly, knowing the power of subtle rebellion. Around the same time, he helped 3 6 Mafia transition from Memphis hustlers to Academy Award winners. When they took home the Oscar for It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp in 2006, it symbolized more than a victory, it was hip-hop's official arrival at Hollywood's front door. Chris's influence wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. Forbes named him one of the most influential talent managers in America. Executives admired his control. Artists trusted his heart. He was equally comfortable in a Bronx studio or a Madison Avenue meeting, moving between the two worlds that had defined his life. For those close to him, success hadn't changed who he was. He still preferred long nights in his office, talking with artists about life rather than contracts. He was disciplined, careful, and humble, a man who wore power lightly, Yet even at his peak, there were moments when his eyes gave him away. Behind the calm, something restless was growing, the weight of responsibility, the exhaustion of being the one everyone leaned on. He once told a journalist, "You can't manage artists unless you understand their hunger. I've been hungry, that's why I get it." It wasn't a line for publicity, it was the truth. Chris Lighty had turned struggle into strategy, survival into success. From the streets of the Bronx to the boardrooms of Manhattan, he had rewritten what it meant to be a music executive. But every empire has its cracks. And in the shadows of his triumph, a quieter story was beginning to unfold, one that no deal or dollar could fix. At the height of his career, Chris Lighty looked like he had it all: money, power, respect. Violator management was at its peak. His artists were global superstars, and his name carried quiet authority across every label and brand in the business. Yet beneath the confidence, something inside him was shifting. Success had brought him everything he thought he wanted, but it also trapped him in a life that never stopped demanding more. Every phone call was another problem to solve, another artist to save, another deal to close. He was no longer just managing careers, he was managing crises. The first signs of tension came from within the industry itself. His once close relationship with Leor Cohen had started to fray. They had built an empire together, but now Chris felt pushed aside. Def Jam was changing. Younger, louder executives like Irv Gotti were becoming the label's new face, and Chris, the quiet strategist, was seen as part of the old guard. He didn't argue, he simply walked away. Leaving Def Jam should have been a relief, but it only marked the beginning of a more dangerous chapter. The streets had followed him into the boardroom. In January 2003, gunfire erupted at the Violator office. No one was hurt, but the message was unmistakable. A month later, Busta Rhymes' SUV, the same make and model as Chris's, was sprayed with bullets. Busta wasn't inside, but everyone knew what it meant. For the first time, Chris began wearing a bulletproof vest to work. The man who once helped others stay safe was now the one living under threat. Rumors spread fast that it was tied to the 50 Cent and Jimmy Henchman feud, that it was about money, that it was about loyalty. Chris said little, but friends noticed the toll. His laughter faded. He stopped going out. He trusted fewer people. Even his victories started to feel hollow. He once told a friend, "People think success means peace. It doesn't. It just means you have more to lose." He had always carried himself like a rock, dependable, focused, professional. But now, the pressure was starting to eat at him. Between managing artists, expanding businesses, and keeping up appearances, Chris was burning out. He worked late nights, skipped meals, and barely slept. The calls never stopped coming, not from reporters, not from artists, not from creditors. He had spent his life helping others rise, but rarely allowed himself to rest. And at home, things weren't easier. His marriage to Veronica had become strained, marked by constant arguments and long silences. Friends said he still loved her, but the relationship was heavy with stress, financial, emotional, and personal. For the first time, Chris seemed tired. The optimism that once fueled him had dimmed. He was still the man everyone looked to for answers, but now he was asking silent questions of his own. He began to notice how fragile success really was, how one misstep, one wrong deal, one phone call could change everything. The same ambition that lifted him up was now his greatest burden. By 2006, Forbes had called him one of the most influential managers in America, but that title came with a loneliness that few could imagine. The boy from the Bronx had built a bridge between the streets and corporate America, but he was stuck in the middle, never fully belonging to either world. When friends would ask if he was happy, he'd smile and change the subject. He once said, almost jokingly, "I keep everyone else standing tall, so someone's got to be holding me up too." But no one ever asked who that person was. The spotlight around him was still shining bright. The business was booming. Yet in the quiet moments, in the pauses between meetings and phone calls, Chris Lighty was already beginning to fade into the shadows of his own success. By the late 2000s, the glow that once surrounded Chris Lighty had begun to dim. The same drive that had made him unstoppable now pushed him into exhaustion. The music industry was changing fast. Digital downloads were replacing CDs, streaming was on the horizon, and management firms were shrinking. Chris was still respected, still powerful, but the game no longer played by the rules he had mastered. Then came a series of hits that even he couldn't block. In 2007, Chris entered a business deal with Hollywood agent Michael Ovitz, aiming to help his artists cross over into movies and television. When the partnership fell apart, Ovitz sued and won. Chris was ordered to pay over $2 million plus legal fees. To the outside world, he brushed it off. Inside, it stung. He wasn't used to losing. Around the same time, he invested heavily with financier Bernie Madoff, who was later exposed for running one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history. Chris lost millions. Some reports claimed his account had once held over $20 million gone in an instant. It wasn't just about money, it was about pride. For a man who had built everything from nothing, losing control felt like betrayal. The economy crashed, and so did the industry. Artists were selling fewer albums, tours were riskier, endorsements dried up. Violator had to downsize. Chris cut staff, sold off properties, and carried the weight of keeping everyone afloat. He still walked into meetings with confidence, but those who knew him said his eyes had changed, tired, distant, searching for something to hold on to. At home, things were no easier. His marriage to Veronica was unraveling under the same financial strain. Arguments turned into silence, and silence turned into distance. Yet, he still tried to keep up appearances. He took his children on trips, smiled at industry events, played the role of the steady hand. But friends noticed that his trademark laugh, the one that used to fill rooms, was disappearing. By 2010, the recession had forced him to rethink everything. He brokered a small Sprite endorsement for Drake, a gesture of goodwill that paid only $50,000. When asked why he did it, Chris said, "I wanted to see another young manager win." That was who he was. Even while struggling, he gave others opportunities. He launched a website called PleaseListenToMyDemo.com, a digital platform for unsigned artists to share music directly with professionals. It was forward-thinking, a sign that Chris still believed in discovery. But despite his vision, the site never reached its full potential. Behind closed doors, he battled depression. He had been diagnosed years earlier, after checking himself into a clinic in Connecticut for suicidal thoughts. Most of his colleagues never knew. He hid his pain behind calm professionalism, refusing to let anyone see the cracks. The man who once brought structure to chaos was now living in it. Bills piled up, lawsuits lingered, and the business he had built was slipping from his control. He had become the center of a storm, financial, emotional, spiritual, and yet he kept going. Every morning, he showed up. Every night, he answered his phone. Because that's what Chris Lighty did. He held it all together, even when it was breaking him apart. On the morning of the 30th of August 2012, Chris Lighty woke up like it was any other day. He had plans, meetings to attend, calls to return, and business still to fix. No one around him sensed that something was wrong. But by noon, the man who helped build modern hip-hop would be gone. That day began with tension at home. Movers were outside his Bronx townhouse, packing up furniture. His wife Veronica was ending their marriage after a summer filled with arguments. Their daughter, Tiffany, had just left for college in Canada. Chris had dropped her off at the airport only hours before. When he returned home, words turned into shouting. Minutes later, a gunshot echoed from the backyard. When police arrived, they found Chris lying on the patio, a 9mm pistol by his side. Veronica told officers he had said, "I'm tired of all this," before pulling the trigger. It was ruled a suicide within hours. But to those who knew him, the story didn't make sense. Family and friends said Chris wasn't suicidal. He had just agreed to a $4 million tour deal with 50 Cent. He was planning new projects. His mother said he had fought too hard to give up like that. His brother Mike called it impossible. And then came the inconsistencies. 2 movers were inside the house that day, but they were never questioned. 2 nannies were also present, not interviewed. The police closed the case in under 7 hours. No residue test was done on Chris's hands. No DNA analysis was run on the weapon. His family requested a second autopsy by famed pathologist Dr. Michael Baden, but the results were never released. To make things stranger, witnesses said Chris's wife's ex-husband was already at the house before the police arrived. The same man Veronica later claimed wasn't there. His brother Mike believed Chris was murdered. He said the argument might have turned violent, that something went wrong and that the truth was buried in the rush to close the case. 50 Cent didn't believe the official story either. He hired a private investigator, Scott Lehman, who discovered gaps in the NYPD's work, missing residue tests, ignored evidence, and conflicting statements. When asked why the investigation stopped so quickly, Lehman said simply, "They wanted it to be over." Even Veronica's public statements raised questions. In one interview, she described Chris as a genius too smart to end his life. Yet later, she said he was under immense financial stress and had just snapped. Rumors spread fast about tax debts, depression, infidelity, but no one could agree on what was true. All that remained were fragments. A phone call from his accountant that morning, the mover's confused statements, and a man whose life had been built on control, suddenly found in chaos. At his funeral, the church was filled wall to wall. LL Cool J, Busta Rhymes, Missy Elliott, Fat Joe, Mariah Carey, and 50 Cent all gathered to say goodbye. Two longtime rivals, 50 Cent and Fat Joe, even shook hands for the first time in years, a silent tribute to the man who had always kept peace among giants. In death, Chris Lighty brought people together, just as he had in life. But the questions never left. How could a man so brilliant, so careful, so full of plans, simply vanish under a cloud of unanswered details? Maybe that's why his story still lingers, because even now, more than a decade later, the truth about Chris Lighty doesn't rest as easily as his legacy does. Long after his passing, Chris Lighty's influence still runs through every corner of American pop culture. You can feel it in every rapper who signs a sneaker deal, every artist who owns their masters, every brand that sees hip-hop not as rebellion, but as partnership. The industry he helped build hasn't stopped evolving. It's simply been walking the path he paved. Chris wasn't just a manager. He was an architect. He designed a blueprint for how black artists could take control of their business, their image, and their wealth. In the 1980 and 90, hip-hop executives were often dismissed as street hustlers. Chris changed that perception. He made professionalism look powerful without losing authenticity. When he walked into a corporate office, he didn't adjust his tone or his clothes. He made the room adjust to him. In an era where many artists were trapped by bad contracts, he taught them how to read the fine print. When the industry paid rappers in crumbs, he showed them how to own the bakery. He turned street knowledge into strategy and taught a generation that intellect was the new hustle. His deals became case studies for a new kind of hip-hop success story. The Vitaminwater partnership proved that artists could have ownership, not just endorsement. The LL Cool J Gap commercial proved that corporate America could be challenged from within. The G-Unit brand proved that a label could be more than music. It could be a movement. Even his smaller projects reflected vision. From working with Sprite and Drake to championing young artists through pleaseListenToMyDemo.com, he never stopped believing in the next generation. Chris saw potential where others saw risk, and opportunity where others saw chaos. In the years after his death, many executives quietly admitted that they had built their careers by following his playbook. What used to be considered bold or unorthodox was now standard industry practice. Artist equity, brand alignment, image ownership, all ideas that Chris Lighty had championed when they were still considered impossible. But his legacy isn't just business. It's emotional. It's cultural. It's about a man who learned how to move between two worlds, the rawness of the Bronx and the precision of Wall Street, without betraying either one. He gave hip-hop something it desperately needed: legitimacy. Before Chris, success for many black managers meant survival, keeping their artists paid and protected. After Chris, it meant expansion, learning how to negotiate with billion-dollar corporations on equal ground. He carried that torch with quiet dignity, showing that you didn't need to shout to change the system. You just had to understand it better than anyone else. Even those who never met him felt his impact. Mona Scott Young, who once worked under his wing, went on to create Love and Hip-Hop, a cultural phenomenon that brought hip-hop stories to television audiences around the world. That lineage traces back to Chris, the man who believed that every artist's life was worth documenting, every struggle worth being seen. Today, when artists like Jay-Z, Drake, and Travis Scott negotiate massive brand partnerships, they're walking in the space Chris opened. When young managers study how to balance art and business, his name still comes up a quiet benchmark of integrity and vision. In a business built on noise, Chris Lighty's power was in his silence, his ability to make things move without ever needing to be seen. In the years since his passing, the conversation around Chris Lighty has only deepened. For those inside the industry, he became something larger than a name, a symbol of what integrity, intelligence, and heart could achieve in a business often ruled by ego and chaos. When podcasts and documentaries revisited his story, a pattern emerged. Everyone who had crossed paths with Chris shared the same impression. He was steady, unshakable, and real. They spoke of a man who never raised his voice, who could diffuse tension with a single sentence, and who somehow made people believe in their own potential. Reggie Osei, known to many as Combat Jack, captured that spirit in his 2017 documentary Mogul, The Life and Death of Chris Lighty. Through first-hand accounts, he revealed a man both brilliant and burdened a visionary whose compassion was often mistaken for invulnerability. The series reminded listeners that Chris's genius wasn't just in business, but in empathy, in his ability to understand people, not just profits. Across the internet, fans and artists revisited old interviews and photos, looking for the man behind the legend. They found glimpses of his warmth, his laughter at award shows, his mentorship behind the scenes, his habit of showing up at concerts without announcement. There was something comforting about him, even to those who never met him. Yet, the questions surrounding his death lingered. Some wanted closure, others wanted justice, but most just wanted to honor the good he had done. Over time, the debates quieted, leaving behind something softer gratitude. His friends often said Chris never took credit for anything. He celebrated others. He was the first to clap, the last to leave, the one who remembered birthdays when no one else did. In an industry built on self-promotion, that humility became his lasting lesson. You can see echoes of him today in the managers who mentor their artists with care, in executives who use strategy instead of manipulation, and in artists who fight to own their art rather than sell it away. Those ideas didn't come from seminars or MBA programs. They came from people like Chris Lighty, from lived experience, from survival, from love of the craft. To many, his story also opened an uncomfortable but necessary conversation about mental health in the Black entertainment community. When Chris died, artists like David Banner, Diddy, and LL Cool J began to speak openly about pressure, depression, and the silent battles they faced. For the first time, the hip-hop world was forced to acknowledge that success doesn't always heal what's inside. That shift toward vulnerability, honesty, and care may be the quietest but most profound part of his legacy. He reminded the world that strength isn't about pretending to be fine. Sometimes, it's about admitting when you're not. Today, when younger fans ask who Chris Lighty was, older generations answer with reverence. They tell stories not of scandal or mystery, but a vision of a man who changed how music, culture, and business could coexist. And in a world where so many chase visibility, Chris Lighty proved that real power can live in the shadows. He may have left too soon, but his blueprint remains. Every deal, every dream, every artist who dares to think beyond the mic, they're all part of the world he helped imagine. In the end, Chris Lighty's story isn't just about success or tragedy, it's about what it means to build something that lasts. He rose from the Bronx streets, carried the weight of others' dreams, and reshaped an entire culture without ever needing to be in the spotlight himself. He believed that music wasn't just sound, it was movement. That business wasn't just numbers, it was storytelling. And that loyalty, no matter how costly, was worth everything. Those beliefs guided him from the turntables of the 1980 to the boardrooms of the 2000s, from chaos to creation, from survival to legacy. But behind the accolades and deals, he was still human, a father, a friend, a man who felt deeply. His life reminds us that even the strongest among us can struggle quietly. That success doesn't always silence the noise inside. And yet, even in absence, he continues to teach. Every time a young artist demands ownership, every time a manager stands up for fairness, every time hip-hop takes another step into global influence, that's Chris's echo. His work lives not in headlines, but in the decisions made by those he inspired. Some stars burn fast, others fade slowly. But there are a few, like Chris Lighty, whose light doesn't fade at all. It simply moves into new spaces, illuminating others along the way. So maybe the question isn't what happened to Chris Lighty. Maybe it's what happened because of him. Because of Chris, the business of hip-hop became something more than survival. It became self-determination. Because of Chris, artists learned that power doesn't always have to shout. Sometimes, It simply signs the deal and walks away quietly. His story is a reminder that legacy isn't built in fame, but in faith in people, in dreams, in the belief that we can come from nothing and still change everything. If you remember him, speak his name. If his story moved you, share it, because stories like his deserve to live, not as mysteries, but as lessons. And if you ever feel like the world has forgotten your light, remember his. Some stars never fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see.